Have you ever heard of the ACE study?
Ah, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And it's pretty striking when you see the numbers. They found that even in what we think of as stable middle-class communities, a surprisingly large number of people reported having experienced some kind of significant adversity in childhood.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, only about a third of the folks in that study said they had no adverse experiences at all.
Wow, so two-thirds of people in a quote-unquote stable environment had at least one ACE. That's a pretty big number when you think about it.
Right. It really makes you think about how those early experiences, whether big or small, might continue to impact our lives in all sorts of ways we don't even realize.
Absolutely. I mean, it seems like trauma in one form or another is much more common than we might want to believe.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're going to explore the profound ways that trauma can affect us, both mentally and physically. But just as importantly, we're going to look at the possibilities for healing and recovery.
It's such an important topic, and for this deep dive, we're going to be drawing on the incredible work of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and his book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Have you read it?
Oh yeah, cover to cover. It's a really groundbreaking exploration of trauma and its impact.
Now, for you listening, you might be coming to this for all sorts of reasons. Maybe you have personal experiences with trauma, maybe you work in a field where you encounter it, or maybe you're just curious about how these things work.
Or all of the above.
Exactly. And whatever your reason is, our goal is to really unpack these complex issues in a way that is clear, accessible, and insightful.
And we won't get too bogged down in jargon either.
Right. We want to make this a journey of discovery for everyone. So our mission today is to really delve into the many layers of how trauma leaves its mark.
We'll be looking at how it affects our brains, our bodies, even our memories, and our closest relationships. And crucially, we want to highlight the possibilities for healing that van der Kolk discusses so thoroughly.
Exactly. From the biology of trauma to all the ways we can approach treatment and recovery. So let's jump in, shall we?
Let's do it.
Okay, so first things first. What is trauma, and how does it affect us on such a deep level?
Well, it's important to remember that our brains are essentially wired for survival, right?
Right.
And when something traumatic happens, those survival mechanisms go into overdrive. But here's the thing, and van der Kolk really highlights this, even long after the danger has passed. Even the slightest hint of a trigger can reactivate those same brain circuits. And it floods our system with stress hormones as if the trauma is happening all over again.
So it's like our brain's alarm system gets stuck in the on position.
Precisely.
And that reactivation, that can manifest in our daily lives in some pretty tangible ways, can it?
Absolutely. You might have these waves of unpleasant emotions that seem to come out of nowhere, or intense physical sensations. And people can find themselves reacting in ways that feel impulsive or even aggressive.
Almost like they lose control of the wheel for a moment.
Exactly. And these post-traumatic reactions can be completely baffling, even to the person experiencing them.
It's also interesting how van der Kolk talks about our tendency, both individually and as a society, to shy away from facing the full reality of trauma.
Yeah, it's like there's this collective discomfort with acknowledging just how prevalent things like abuse and violence really are.
We almost want to think of them as isolated incidents happening to other people, not something that could happen to us or people we know.
Right. And that avoidance, while understandable, can be a huge barrier to healing.
And then there's this concept of numbing, which is almost counterintuitive.
How so?
Well, people who have experienced trauma might actually feel emotionally distant, not just from others, but even from their own feelings.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Van der Kolk gives this example of a lawyer, I think his name was Tom, who felt like he was watching his own life from a distance.
Like an outsider looking in.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
He could function at work, go through the motions, but there's no real sense of feeling, no real connection to his own life.
And that numbing, that emotional detachment, it's a way of protecting ourselves from overwhelming pain. But as Tom's story shows, it can come at a pretty steep price.
Absolutely. It's also fascinating how trauma can distort our imagination and even our basic perception of the world.
What way?
Well, van der Kolk talks about using the Rorschach ink blot tests with veterans. Some were disturbed by what they saw, but a few had a really interesting reaction. They saw nothing at all.
Nothing.
Yeah. It was like their capacity for imagination, for making meaning out of those ambiguous shapes, had been completely shut down.
And what about the ones who did see something?
A lot of them just kept replaying scenes from their trauma. They lacked that mental flexibility, that playfulness that we usually associate with imagination.
So it was as if Their trauma was hijacking their ability to engage with the world creatively.
Exactly. And here's a really strange paradox that van der Kolk points out.
Hmm.
For some survivors, the traumatic event, the very thing that caused so much pain, can become their main source of meaning. They might actually feel most alive when they're re-experiencing those memories, even if they're painful.
That's a tough one to wrap your head around.
It is. It really shows just how complex trauma can be. And van der Kolk also talks about how in the past, veterans were often misdiagnosed and mistreated.
How so?
Well, they would get these general diagnoses like alcoholism or depression without anyone really understanding the underlying trauma. And the medications they were given just made them feel numb and disconnected. It actually often made things worse.
Yeah, it's crucial to treat the root cause, not just the symptoms.
And that leads us to the revolutions in understanding the mind and brain that van der Kolk goes on to discuss. There was this significant shift away from understanding feelings and relationships toward this very biological brain disease model.
So, viewing mental health more like a physical illness.
Exactly. And this was fueled by research, some of which showed that, at least for certain conditions, just medication seemed to have better outcomes than therapy.
Interesting. So that really pushed the focus toward biological factors.
It did. And van der Kolk delves into some fascinating studies, like the one by Mayer and Seligman on inescapable shock.
What was that about?
They worked with animals, putting them in situations where they couldn't escape electric shocks. And what they found was that the animals eventually developed learned helplessness.
They just gave up.
Exactly. Even when they were later given the opportunity to escape, they didn't even try. They had learned that their actions were futile.
So this idea that feeling powerless can have a lasting impact, even when circumstances change.
Right. And this really helps us understand the passivity and resignation that we often see in people who have experienced trauma.
It's like that feeling of helplessness gets ingrained even when there's a possibility for things to be different.
Exactly. And then he gets into this really interesting, almost counterintuitive phenomena.
What's that?
How some people who have experienced trauma actively seek out experiences that would repel most of us.
Can you give an example?
He talks about Julia, a woman who survived rape and then ended up involved with a violent pimp.
Wow. It seems like she's almost recreating that traumatic experience.
It is like that. And van der Kolk explains this as a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, even if it's pain, to counteract that numbness we talked about earlier.
So it's a way of escaping that emptiness.
It can be. And this ties into what's called the opponent process theory. The idea is that our brains are constantly trying to maintain balance, and strong emotions trigger an opposing response.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Think about it like this. You experience intense fear, and then your body releases endorphins to counteract that fear. And those endorphins, they actually feel good.
So it's like a natural painkiller.
Exactly. And van der Kolk even mentions how wounded soldiers often don't feel pain right away because the intensity of their emotions actually blocks the pain signals.
So even in the midst of a terrible experience, those strong emotions can create a kind of temporary shield.
It's incredible how our bodies and minds work, isn't it?
It really is.
Now, let's get into the brain itself. Van der Kolk uses this really powerful example of a brain scan from a woman named Marcia to show how trauma leaves its mark.
Okay, I'm interested to hear this.
So, Marcia had experienced trauma in the past, and even years later, when she was shown things related to that trauma, her amygdala, the fear center in her brain, lit up like a Christmas tree.
So even just thinking about the trauma was enough to trigger that fear response.
It was, and her brain was essentially reacting as if the danger was still present, even though it was long gone.
Wow, that's powerful.
And it's not just those big narrative memories that get stored. Van der Kolk explains how these unprocessed sensory fragments of the trauma, like specific sounds, smells, or physical sensations, those can get registered separately in the brain, almost like little isolated pockets of memory.
And those can trigger flashbacks.
They can. Because they're not integrated into a coherent story, those fragments can bypass the rational part of the brain and just trigger that intense emotional and physical response.
That makes sense.
Another interesting thing they found from brain scans is that during flashbacks, the right side of the brain tends to light up, while the left side often deactivates.
Why is that significant?
Well, think of the right brain as the emotional brain, the part that processes sensory information and nonverbal experiences. And the left brain is more about language, logic, and linear time. So during a flashback, it's like the emotional brain takes over, and the part that can put things into words, make sense of time, just shuts down.
So it's almost like being trapped in that emotional experience without the ability to process it or understand it in a rational way.
Exactly. And van der Kolk talks about this distinction between what he calls the emotional brain, which includes the reptilian brain and the limbic system, and the neocortex, which is the more recently evolved part of the brain, responsible for higher level thinking.
So you have these older, more primitive parts of the brain that are primarily focused on survival.
Right. And then you have the neocortex, which allows for things like planning, reasoning, and impulse control.
And trauma can really disrupt the balance between these different parts of the brain.
It does. He talks about this imbalance that can happen between the amygdala, that fear center, and the medial prefrontal cortex, which is like a regulator. In PTSD, this imbalance can lead to a lot of difficulty in controlling emotions and impulses.
Because the fear center is basically calling the shots.
That's right. It's like the watchtower of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, isn't effectively calming down the overly sensitive smoke detector, which is the amygdala.
And he illustrates this with those incredibly powerful brain scans of Stan and Ute, right?
He does. Stan, during a flashback, his scan showed an intensely active amygdala. He was reliving that trauma in vivid detail. But Ute, her scan was almost completely blank. She was dissociating, essentially checking out mentally.
Two completely different responses to the same traumatic event.
And it shows how trauma can manifest in such diverse ways. Then he talks about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or DLPFC, which is like the brain's internal timekeeper.
And trauma can mess with that.
It can.
Yeah.
It disrupts our sense of time, leading to that feeling that the traumatic experience is not just a memory, but something that is still happening in the present.
I can see how that would be incredibly distressing.
It is. And then there's depersonalization, which is another form of dissociation. It's this feeling of detachment from your own body and emotions.
So feeling like you're not really there.
Exactly. Van der Kolk says he sees this a lot in his patients. They'll recount these horrific stories, but with almost no emotional expression. It's like they're watching themselves from outside their own bodies.
Wow. And it's all a way of coping with overwhelming trauma.
It is. So we've talked about the brain, but trauma also has a profound impact on our bodies and our relationships. Van der Kolk starts by talking about Darwin and how he observed the shared instincts and physical expressions of emotions in humans and animals.
Right, so even animals show physical signs of fear, anger, joy. These are basic primal responses.
Exactly. And then he gets into the autonomic nervous system, which controls those automatic functions in our bodies. It's divided into the sympathetic nervous system, which revs us up for action, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms us down.
And these systems get thrown off balance by trauma, right?
They do. He explains how heart rate variability, or HRV, is a good measure of how flexible this system is.
So how easily we can shift between those states of arousal and calmness.
Right. And he emphasizes how so much of mental and emotional suffering comes down to either problems in our relationships or problems regulating our internal state.
Because if you can't regulate your emotions and you can't connect with others, it's incredibly difficult to feel safe and grounded.
Exactly. And then he introduces Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory, which focuses on the vagus nerve and how it plays a key role in social engagement and regulating our nervous system.
I've heard of the vagus nerve, but tell me more about this theory.
Well, Porges talks about the vagal ventral complex, or VVC, which is involved in those feelings of safety and connection that we get from positive social interactions. He emphasizes how important those early attuned interactions, like between a mother and her baby, are for developing this capacity for social engagement.
It's like that early bonding creates a template for healthy relationships later in life.
It does. And then he contrasts the VVC with the dorsal vagal complex, or DVC, which is activated in those freeze responses we have when we feel completely overwhelmed by threat. It can lead to dissociation and that feeling of shutting down completely.
So it's like our bodies have these different pathways for responding to danger, depending on the level of threat.
Exactly. And trauma can throw these systems off, leaving people stuck in either a hypervigilant state, always on edge, or in a state of numbness and disconnection.
It's like their internal threat detection system is either on high alert or completely shut down.
Right. And van der Kolk brings in Antonio Damasio's work on the proto-self, which is this basic preconscious sense of ourselves that comes from those background feelings in our bodies. He says it's like this wordless knowledge that forms the foundation of our sense of self.
So our sense of being a separate individual self is rooted in our physical sensations.
It is. And this is why when we relive those strong negative emotions associated with trauma, We can also re-experience those physical sensations from the original event. That feeling of fear, panic, helplessness, it all comes back.
It's like our bodies remember the trauma even if our conscious minds don't.
Exactly. And he talks about how people who have been traumatized often chronically feel unsafe in their own bodies. They're constantly bombarded with these warning signals and often try to numb or suppress them.
It's like their body becomes the enemy.
It can be like that. And says the price we pay for ignoring these bodily messages is that we lose our ability to accurately sense what's truly dangerous and what's safe. We lose that trust in our own internal experience.
And that can make it incredibly difficult to navigate the world effectively.
It does. He shares this study with children who had been abused, and they were shown these completely harmless pictures. But their reactions were so different from the control group.
How so?
The abused children, they were constantly scanning for threat. They had a really hard time seeing anything as safe, even when it objectively was. It's like their perception of the world was permanently altered by their trauma.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. And then he beautifully illustrates the importance of these early interactions between a caregiver and a child. He uses the example of a mother and baby playing. It's this back and forth of connection, rupture, and repair.
Those moments of misattunement and then coming back together are so crucial, aren't they?
They are. It's like a dance that teaches the child about safety and trust.
And if that dance gets disrupted, it can have lasting consequences.
It can. He talks about the work of John Bowlby and Donald Winnicott, who really emphasized how those early interactions lay the groundwork for a child's developing sense of self and their understanding of reality.
So those early experiences, they really shape who we become on a fundamental level.
They do. He explains the concept of secure attachment, which is what happens when a child has a consistent, reliable, and responsive caregiver. It fosters this deep sense of emotional security.
And that security becomes the foundation for healthy relationships throughout life.
Exactly. But he also makes the point that children have this innate drive to attach to their caregivers no matter what. So even when they're faced with neglect or abuse, they'll develop coping mechanisms to try to get their needs met.
So they're constantly adapting to their environment, even if that environment is harmful.
Right. And those early coping strategies, while necessary for survival, can create problems later on.
Because they might not be adaptive in healthy relationships.
Exactly. He also mentions how a parent's own stress level can impact a child's response to painful events. He cites a study of children with burns, and those who had secure attachments to their mothers actually needed less pain medications.
So the emotional support from the mother actually helped them manage their physical pain better.
It did. It's amazing how interconnected these things are.
Absolutely.
Now, let's talk about the cost of abuse and neglect. Van der Kolk talks about how these experiences can lead to this feeling of being fragmented, split off from yourself, and needing to go on this long journey of reunification and healing.
It's like parts of yourself get pushed away or hidden to cope with the pain.
It is like that. He tells the story of Kathy, who was sexually abused as a child, and she instinctively blamed herself for everything bad that happened in her life. It just shows how deeply these feelings rooted in trauma can become ingrained.
That's so sad.
It is. And then he introduces this really powerful and chilling concept of soul murder.
Soul murder, what does that mean?
He says it's what happens when you lose the ability to distinguish between what's real and what's imagined. It's like your sense of self gets completely shattered.
And to survive, you essentially have to shut down awareness and live in denial.
Exactly. It's a profound loss of the authentic self. He then touches on how difficult it can be to even take a trauma history from someone.
Because it can be so painful to talk about.
It can. And there's often shame involved as well. So he mentions the Traumatic Antecedents Questionnaire, or TKQ, as a less direct approach to gathering this information.
So it's a way of gently opening the door to those difficult conversations.
It is. And then he circles back to the ACE study, detailing those key findings about how prevalent adverse childhood experiences are and how strongly they correlate with all sorts of negative outcomes in adulthood.
Like what?
Everything from depression and substance abuse to chronic health problems and even early death.
Wow. So the ripple effects of early trauma can be felt throughout a person's entire life.
They can. And it's not just humans either. He mentions Stephen Swomey's research with rhesus monkeys. They found that early stress and disruptions in caregiving could lead to monkeys developing either anxious or aggressive personality types.
So even in animals, early experiences have a lasting impact on their behavior.
They do. And it really highlights that complex interplay between genetics and environment. Van der Kolk also talks about the limitations of the standard PTSD diagnosis, especially for children who have experienced chronic abuse and neglect.
What are those limitations?
Well, the PTSD diagnosis often focuses on single-incident traumas, like a car accident or a natural disaster. But it doesn't fully capture the complexity of developmental trauma, which happens over time and often within the context of the most important relationships in a child's life.
So it can lead to kids getting misdiagnosed.
It can. They might get labeled as oppositional defiant or attention-seeking without anyone really understanding the root cause of their behavior.
And that can have huge implications for how they're treated.
It does. He then talks about L. Allen Schroeff's longitudinal study, which really highlights how important the parent-child relationship is in shaping a child's development.
It's not just nature versus nurture. It's the complex interaction between the two.
Right. And he specifically mentions the developmental challenges faced by girls who have experienced sexual abuse, things like difficulties in forming friendships, self-hatred, and even changes in their biology that can lead to early puberty and riskier behaviors.
It's tragic how those early experiences can set them up for more hardship later on.
It is. And then he throws out this thought-provoking comparison. He points out how the United States has a much higher incarceration rate than countries like Norway and the Netherlands, which prioritize early childhood well-being.
So he's suggesting a link between how we treat our children and the overall health of our society.
Exactly. That's a powerful idea.
It is.
Now, let's delve back into the world of memory. Van der Kolk revisits the work of Pierre Janet, who really pioneered our understanding of traumatic memory. Janet distinguished between narrative memory, which is how we typically remember events, and traumatic memory, which is much more fragmented and sensory-based.
So traumatic memories aren't always stored like a story with a beginning, middle, and end.
They're not. They're often more like these flashes of images, sounds, smells, and physical sensations without a clear timeline.
And Janet also introduced concepts like amnesia, dissociation, and reenactment, right?
He did. And he used the case of a patient named Irene to illustrate these phenomena. Irene had experienced severe trauma, and her memories were incredibly fragmented and confusing. She would often reenact aspects of the trauma without even realizing it.
So she was reliving those experiences unconsciously.
Exactly. And this brings us to the early days of talk therapy. Van der Kolk talks about the work of Charcot, Breuer, and Freud, who were really pioneers in recognizing how these unprocessed traumatic memories could cause all sorts of psychological symptoms. They called it hysteria at the time.
And their work led to the development of psychoanalysis.
It did. And one of their key insights was that these hysterics were essentially suffering from reminiscences, these vivid and unintegrated memories of past traumas.
And that talking about these memories, bringing them into conscious awareness, could be a path to healing.
Exactly. He also traces the history of how we've understood shell shock, which we now call PTSD.
Which initially wasn't even recognized as a legitimate condition, right?
It wasn't. At first, it was seen as a weakness or a character flaw.
Wow.
But gradually, there was this shift toward recognizing it as a genuine psychological injury, something caused by the overwhelming stress of war.
Which was a huge step forward in understanding the impact of trauma.
It was. And then he talks about Lenore Ter's study on repressed memories of child sexual abuse. She found that a lot of women who had documented histories of abuse didn't actually consciously remember those experiences.
So their memories were completely blocked out.
It seems that way. And this raised a lot of debate about the nature of memory and whether repressed memories are real.
Because if you can't remember something, does it mean it didn't happen?
It's a complex question. And Van der Kolk ultimately concludes that our brains process traumatic memories differently than other kinds of memories.
So it's not just about forgetting, it's about how the brain stores and retrieves those experiences.
Exactly. And that brings us to the really crucial topic of healing and recovery. Van der Kolk emphasizes that while you can't undo the past, you can absolutely address the lasting impact of trauma.
Which is a hopeful message, because it means there's a possibility for change.
There is. And one of the key things he stresses is the importance of reconnecting with your inner experience.
What does that mean?
It means learning to pay attention to the sensations in your body, learning to name them without judgment, and just observing how they change and shift over time.
So it's about developing this mindful awareness of your internal state.
Exactly. And he talks about how mindfulness practices, like meditation, can be incredibly helpful in calming down that overactive sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight response.
It's like learning to hit the brakes on that constant state of arousal.
It is. But he also points out that you need to develop some capacity to tolerate your feelings in the present before you can start digging into those painful memories from the past.
Because if you're not grounded, it can be really overwhelming to revisit those experiences.
Exactly. He also talks about how trauma inflicted by caregivers, the people who are supposed to love and protect you, can be particularly devastating.
Because it violates that basic trust that's so fundamental to our sense of safety.
It does, and it often leads to all sorts of maladaptive coping mechanisms, like emotional shutdown or dissociation.
It's like those defenses become necessary for survival in a dangerous environment.
Right. And he really emphasizes how important the therapeutic relationship is in the healing process. He says the therapist needs to approach the individual with genuine curiosity, not just see them as a collection of symptoms to be fixed.
It's about seeing the whole person, not just the diagnosis.
Exactly. And he shares some really heartwarming examples of how even seemingly small things, like a positive memory from childhood or a connection with an animal, can be the starting point for healing.
It's those little sparks of hope that can ignite a bigger transformation.
They can. And he describes this incredible experience he witnessed in a women's group where they were using rhythm, singing, and movement to process their trauma. It led to this profound emotional release and a sense of deep connection.
It sounds like they were able to tap into something primal and healing through those shared experiences.
It was. He talks about how important it is to include body-based therapies in trauma treatment, things like massage, yoga, or dance.
Because trauma gets stored in the body, not just the mind.
Exactly. And he introduces these really interesting approaches like sensorimotor psychotherapy and somatic experiencing, which focus on working directly with those physical sensations and helping people feel safe in their bodies.
So it's about re-regulating that nervous system and learning to feel safe again.
It is. He also discusses cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which is a common approach to treating trauma.
What's his take on that?
He acknowledges that it can be helpful for some people, but he also points out that revisiting those traumatic memories can sometimes reactivate the fear response and make things worse.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
It's not. He then discusses some really promising research on using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for treating PTSD.
Really? MDMA, like ecstasy?
Yeah. It sounds counterintuitive, but in a therapeutic setting, MDMA can actually help people access those traumatic memories with less fear and more self-compassion.
And he also mentions EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
He does. He describes it as a way to stimulate the brain's natural healing process and help integrate those traumatic memories into a coherent narrative.
So it's about helping the brain process those experiences in a way that reduces their emotional charge.
Exactly. He then introduces internal family systems, or IFS therapy.
What's that about?
It's a really interesting approach that views the psyche as comprised of different parts, like the protector, the critic, the child. And it focuses on understanding and working with these parts to heal internal conflicts and access the core self, which is this undamaged essence within us.
So it's about getting those different parts of ourselves to work together harmoniously.
Exactly. And he talks about how IFS can be really helpful in understanding those seemingly contradictory feelings and behaviors that often arise from trauma.
It's like those different parts are all trying to protect us in their own way.
Right. And then he describes this other fascinating approach called Peso-Boyden System Psychomotor Therapy, or PBSP.
What's unique about that one?
It involves creating new emotional scenarios to counteract the old traumatic ones. He gives this example of a therapist using a couch and a lamp to symbolize a protective figure in a patient's life.
So it's almost like acting out a new, more positive experience.
It is like that. And he says PBSP can be really powerful in helping people feel safe, loved, and protected in a way they may never have experienced before.
Wow, it sounds like there's a whole world of innovative approaches to treating trauma out there.
There is. And Van der Kolk also talks about neurofeedback, which is a way of training the brain to regulate itself better.
How does that work?
It involves monitoring brainwave activity and giving the person feedback in real time so they can learn to shift those patterns.
Interesting. So it's like giving the brain a mirror to see what it's doing and then learn to do things differently.
Exactly. And he shares some incredible stories of how neurofeedback has helped people with PTSD, anxiety, and even addiction.
So it's a promising new tool for rewiring the brain.
It is. And finally, he talks about the power of theater and communal rituals in healing trauma.
How so?
He describes how theater provides a safe space for people to express their emotions, connect with others, and challenge that feeling of isolation that often accompanies trauma.
So it's about using creativity and connection to heal those wounds.
Exactly. And he shares inspiring examples of how theater programs have helped veterans, incarcerated individuals, and young people who have experienced trauma.
That's amazing.
It really is. So that was a lot to take in, wasn't it?
It was, but it was fascinating.
So what are some of the key takeaways for you?
I think the biggest one is that trauma is incredibly common and has a profound impact on our minds, bodies, and relationships. And that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. There are so many different approaches to healing, and what works for one person might not work for another.
Right. It's about finding what resonates with you and what helps you feel safe and empowered.
And I also loved how he emphasized the importance of reconnecting with your body and your emotions.
Me too. That's so foundational to healing.
And the power of connection, of feeling seen and understood by others.
It's incredible how healing those authentic connections can be.
It really is.
So for you listening, I encourage you to take some time to reflect on what resonated with you today. Maybe explore some of the approaches we discussed or delve deeper into Van der Kolk's work.
And remember, healing is possible.
It is. And I'll leave you with this question to ponder. Given how prevalent trauma is, what are some ways we can create a more trauma-informed society? A world where people feel safe, supported, and empowered to heal?
That's a great question to think about. Thanks for this deep dive.
Thanks for joining me. It's been a pleasure.